Okay, so this week we're going to start talking about freedom and the voluntary and the chosen, as Aristotle and Aquinas discussed them. Um, the first thing to kind of keep in mind with this is that what is voluntary is, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, is something that we contribute to. We have a role to play. We actually are agents of what occurs. We have some responsibility for our actions. Um, in other words, in a voluntary situation, these are our actions. We actually do something. It's not the case that something is just done to us and we are completely passive about it or can contribute nothing. So just to kind of get that discussion going, I want to just think of this little globe ball here. I'm throwing it around right now, up and down. The direction this thing goes, the speed with which it goes, um, the force with which it's moved, none of that is up to the ball in any way. The ball is being moved about by something completely external to it, namely myself. So the ball doesn't really provide any kind of agency here. It's not doing anything. Everything is being done to it. It's just having all these things done to it. So that's not what we're getting at. That provides a foil. Now, what would start to be the opposite of that? Well, the opposite of that is when something has its own kind of inner principle, some ability, capacity within itself to act in a certain way or to do certain things. Now, Aristotle and Aquinas following him talk about this ability, this inner principle, as the nature of something. In Greek, the term is physis, hence one of Aristotle's books is called Physics, because it's an exploration of what is natural and the motion that occurs by nature. Now, physis or nature for something is this principle or ability, power within it to move about and do things in the world in a certain kind of way. So let's use the ball again as an example or as a foil. Now, if I put this on the ground, it just stays there. If I put this on this table, it'll just stay there. It won't do anything. Interestingly enough, we talked 2 weeks ago about the example of an acorn. Now, the acorn, unlike the ball, is actually a natural thing. This is artificial, but an acorn in my hand, you would think, oh, that acorn is a natural thing. Moreover, as a natural thing, it has within it the ability to act and move in a certain way. And what is that ability played out? Well, it plays out when we see this thing actually grows into a small sapling and then to a full reformed oak tree. So that acorn growing into an oak tree is a process that is done obviously when there's sufficient rainfall, when the soil has a proper nutrients within it, when there's proper sunlight, when it's not too hot, when there's no frost, etc. So there's circumstances or conditions that have to be in the right order in order for that growth to occur. But it's not the case that I go into the soil and I start like pulling the oak tree out of the acorn. No farmer does that with any kind of crop he has. No gardener does that with his flowers. There's a process that occurs according to the plant itself, according to the tree itself, according to its nature. So when we have a natural thing that's acting according to its nature, it's doing things like growing. And again, the growth is occurring in the soil. It's occurring based on the amount of sunlight, the amount of water, the amount of nutrients in the soil, etc. So it's doing this growth in concert with all these other circumstances. But it's the one growing. It's the one who's, in a sense, responding to the circumstances around it, who's taking in that nutrition, who's taking in the energy, the oak tree that takes in the energy from the sunlight and converts it into energy by the process of photosynthesis. Um, that these sorts of processes are natural because they're not being imposed upon the oak tree. No one is doing it for it. This ball is being moved around merely because I'm the one moving it. I'm the one doing everything here. That's not the case with the oak tree or with anything natural. In those cases, there's something inside of the entity in question, the natural thing in question, which moves it in a certain way, which tends it to act in a certain way. And that inner principle that moves or tends something in a certain way towards growth, towards the collection of nutrition, etc., that's a thing's nature. So a natural thing is, in some respects, some sort of actor in the world. It moves itself in its way, in its existence. This doesn't move itself at all. This ball, like any kind of artificial thing, a natural thing is kind of a self mover in some respect. Again, always in concert, in dialogue with the circumstances. But just as trees, for example, will grow towards the sun, phototropic effect, as it's called, and a lion will move after a zebra, and a human being will pursue a job. All of these are examples of natural things acting according to their nature, their ability to act from themselves towards certain goals, towards what they need, towards being fulfilled as in their respective species, in their respective natures. This ability, this inner principle that directs things in certain ways is nature. Now, what does this have to do with the voluntary? Well, actually, a fair amount, because what Aristotle and Aquinas are getting at here is that something is voluntary for human beings insofar as it follows from our nature. It's something that just isn't. Let me back that up. In a situation where there's something that is natural, that natural thing contributes to the event, it contributes to the process. The acorn, even though it's very tiny, contributes to the actual growth of the oak tree. It's moving that process along. In a similar way, when something is voluntary, the person in question plays a role in what occurs. He contributes something to what happens and to what the outcome is. He's not just a completely passive recipient of the action being done. He is, in some sense, an agent. Now, let's get a little bit more precise with this. So, Aristotle and Aquinas will say that animals and, in some respects, actually do and perform voluntary actions. Now, this is a kind of stretched sense of the term voluntary. It's a wider, pretty broad and wide sense of the term. And what that means is that an animal is actually, in some ways, an agent. He is the one doing something. He is moving himself or herself towards certain goals. So we talked earlier about the example of a lion chasing a zebra on the savannah. In that case, no human being is going and forcing the lion to do that. It's not that an earthquake moved, shook the earth, and then the lion happened to come upon the zebra. No, the lion is moving itself toward the zebra. It's doing it for the very simple reason that it wants to capture, kill, and then eat the zebra. Quite basic. But the lion, in that sense, is much different from the ball. Okay, the ball, I could throw the ball at the zebra, but it'd be inappropriate to say that the ball is moving itself toward the zebra. The ball's not moving itself at all. I am moving the ball. In the, the case with the lion, I don't pick up the lion and throw it toward the zebra. No. Instead, what happens is that the zebra is being pursued by the lion, and the lion is moving itself in that pursuit. The lion is something of an agent here. Okay, so what is voluntary is something that is coming from within somebody. It's a situation in which somebody is something of an agent. He contributes to what happens. He plays a role in what happens and in the outcome. Now, the second thing about the voluntary, beyond this notion of agency and contributing something to the outcome, is the idea of knowledge. All right, let's expand on this a little bit. Now, what Aquinas says is that when we see a situation with human voluntary behavior, not only is, first of all, the human being an agent acting from within himself in the situation, but secondly, the human being who is so acting has a sense of what he's aiming at, and he knows that that's his goal. And he knows that this particular action that he's doing is a means to that goal. So we talked about a lion pursuing a zebra. Now, in that situation, the lion does sense the zebra, it sees it or it smells it, and it moves itself toward it. And it has some kind of awareness for sure of what it's doing, but it's not really able to pause and reflect on what it's doing. It can't consider the merits of its action, can't really plan its action, and it can't consider whether this is a good thing or not. And it can't really think about whether or not it should do this. So all those issues of knowledge are not issues that pertain to the lion. On the other hand, they do pertain to us. So, for example, when a human being goes in pursuit of food or nourishment, we often go to a grocery store. When we go to a grocery store, we think about the sort of food we're going to buy. We want to know if it's going to be healthy, if it's cheap, if it's available, how much we should get, how well it will be liked by the people we live with. So not only are we pursuing certain goals or certain objects of our action, we're also doing this with knowledge, and we're trying to get more knowledge as we do so. And we know that certain things are not, for example, proper to buy, or we know that this is the fastest way to the grocery store, and we can avoid certain traffic jams or something like that. So in that case, what we see is the second factor that comes into play. We see the second factor that comes into play with this issue of the voluntary. Again, first of all, it's a situation in which there's agency and somebody actually acting and contributing something to the situation. But in the second case, we see that there's also this issue of knowledge. Somebody knowing what he's doing, why he's doing it, the proper steps to get there, the best means to do it, whether or not he should do it, etc. He has full awareness of him. He has an awareness of himself and his actions. I don't want to say full because I don't know if we ever have full awareness, but there is some awareness, and there's an awareness that there might even be other possibilities, and there might be other ways to do it. But the certain steps he's taking here seem the best to do, like the certain route he takes to the grocery store seems fastest, or the grocery store he chooses seems to be the cheapest and it has the best available food. So he knows all these things. Now, as we continue to discuss this, what we realize is that the paradigm of acting in a voluntary way is, of course, a human being. That's what it really means to act in a voluntary way, is to do something like human beings do. Now, and that's a now animals do something similar, says Aristotle and Aquinas, insofar as they act from within themselves. They have some agency and they contribute something. The lion is really chasing the zebra, but it's not the full sense of acting in a voluntary way. Aristotle even says that small children, because they don't have the knowledge of the situation, they can't be aware often of themselves and what they're doing and why they're doing it. For those reasons, a small child is not fully acting in a voluntary way in the manner that a mature, grown up human being would. Okay, so that's a sense of what the voluntary is. This action, this behavior that we do that is coming from within us, following from this nature, this inner principle, and also one that's done with knowledge and awareness of what we're doing and why we're doing it. That's the voluntary. Now, what would be the involuntary? Well, the involuntary is a situation in which the human being is not, the person is not really contributing anything to the action, to the event, to the situation, and to the outcome. He's not really playing a role here. So, what can we say in a little bit more detail about this? Well, Aristotle brings up an interesting example to show what the voluntary is. And that will, I think, help illuminate what the involuntary is. So, what's the example Aristotle brings up? Well, the example he brings up to show what the voluntary is somebody who is a sailor on a ship. And in this case, the ship is going through a storm. It's very bad. And the ship may be in danger of sinking. Now, in order for the ship to not sink, they have to lose some of the weight, some of the amount of cargo that's on board. So, what does the sailor do? Well, the sailor actually goes, picks up a bunch of this cargo, and he tosses it overboard. This means the ship will weigh less and be less prone to sink, and the people on board might survive because the ship will survive the storm. Now, some people might think, well, geez, he was forced to do that. So how can that be voluntary? You know, he was forced by the circumstances, by the weight of the ship, or by the intensity of the storm, forced his hand. He had no choice in the matter, right? It was just out of his control. Aristotle says no. Now, granted, He would not do that normally. It's a context-specific thing. Only in that situation where the storm is that bad and the ship has that much weight, etc., would he move to pick up the cargo and toss it overboard. But in that context, he is doing something. He is the one who's going over and picking up these things and tossing them over. The wind is not forcing him to do it. The storm, the rocking of the boat, the motion of the boat does not, it might knock him over occasionally, but it doesn't force him to pick up and then throw things overboard. He is doing that within himself from his inner principle to act, that nature, and also because he knows that doing so will give him him and all the people on board a better chance to survive. So that's not a case of the involuntary. That's actually a case of the voluntary. So we have to be more, we have to look somewhere else to see what the involuntary is. It's not a situation where it seems like desperate circumstances. It's not a situation where it's a last ditch effort. It's not a situation that seems like there's very little left to do. No, even in those situations, you're still acting in a voluntary way insofar as you're the one doing the action, it's coming from you, and you have knowledge of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Therefore, the involuntary is a more limited set of cases where, first of all, you didn't really contribute anything to it in any sense. Those are very limited cases. I mean, one would be walking on the ice and you slip. And it's pretty much like the slip and the force of gravity perhaps bring you down. You fall back into somebody behind him and you hit him. And in that case, you can't really be blamed for that action. You can be pitied for it because it was a total accident that you didn't have any control over. You didn't really exercise any agency about. So in a sense, you can be people can feel sorry for you, but you're not really held liable for that, and therefore it's not really a voluntary action. So that's one set of cases of the involuntary, where you don't contribute anything to what's going on. A second set of cases involves ignorance, where you don't know what's happening. You don't know what might be the outcome of your action. You don't really have a good sense of the circumstances. You're not sure what you should do, but you try one thing. Now, let's get a little bit more specific. Let me give you some examples of this. Suppose that somebody comes to your door and asks for $10 and says, "Hey, man, my car ran out of gas. I just need $10. I go to the gas station, get some gas, drive myself home." It seems like a reasonable request. And he points to his car and says, "That's my car. And there's that gas station across the street. I think I have just enough gas to get to the gas station, but then I'll use the $10, put some gas in the tank, and then I'll be able to drive home." And you're like, "Yeah, sure." So you pull out your wallet, you give him $10. Seems fine. Well, let's further investigate this situation. Let's say that the car the guy pointed to is actually not his car. And the gas station he pointed to is so expensive that $10 isn't actually going to buy him sufficient gas to get home. Now, if the guy knocks on my door and says this, and I don't know that, I don't know it's not his car. I don't know that the gas station is super expensive. I'm not, and let's also say I don't know that the guy would use the money to buy drugs, for example. So I'm ignorant of a lot of things. So when I give him the $10, I'm not really acting from an awareness of the circumstances or what's going on or the outcomes. I don't have knowledge of that. And Aristotle would say in that case, you're acting in an involuntary way. You're not acting in a fully human voluntary way. Now, again, let's go back to what we said in the first week, that for Aristotle and also for Aquinas, a human being is someone who has a rational faculty of his soul, which allows him to think about the world, reflect on it, know it, consider the best thing to do, discuss with other people about what he should do, know what his actions are like, cognize things. So, to act in a fully human manner, according to Aristotle, is to act with some awareness or knowledge of what's going on. And when you don't have that, you're not acting in a fully human manner. You're not acting in a fully voluntary manner. Now, it may be the case that later on I find out what happened. I'm like, oh my gosh, that person I gave money to is actually using this to buy drugs and he lied to me. And I regret that. I feel really badly about it. I wish I could have done differently. If I had known what was going on, I would have acted differently. I didn't know what was going on, and I ended up doing something that probably wasn't so great in this circumstance. But I did so out of a sense of ignorance. I did so because I wasn't cognizant of the situation. I wasn't aware of all the ins and outs, if you will, of what was going on. And for that reason, I'm not acting in a fully human manner. I'm not acting in a voluntary way. It's an involuntary act. All right. So that's a sense of the voluntary and the involuntary. Let me just say, actually, one thing I forgot to say about the voluntary. A voluntary act is something that we can be praised for or blamed for, says Aristotle. What does that mean? Well, in the case of the sailor who voluntarily was throwing the cargo overboard in order for the ship to survive, he may be praised because it helps the ship to get through the storm and the passengers survive. Or in the case of somebody who didn't throw the cargo overboard in a similar sort of circumstances and the ship went down, he might be blamed for that. But you don't get praised or blamed for an involuntary act because, again, it's not something that you either contribute anything to, in the case of the accidental slip and fall into somebody behind me, or it's also not something that you have knowledge about, as in the case of me giving money to the person who turns out to buy it for drugs. So I might say, well, that's too bad, but you can't really blame me because I didn't know what was going on. Can't really be held responsible for something I didn't have a lot of knowledge about. So that's the voluntary, involuntary. And let me say something very briefly about the non-voluntary. It's a little bit odd, but basically the non-voluntary are those situations where I didn't really contribute anything to the event, and more importantly, I didn't have knowledge about what was going on, but I don't regret the outcome. I don't care. Um, so that's a case. That would be a case where somebody acts in ignorance of the situation. He acts from lack of awareness, and maybe something bad happens, but he's like, doesn't bother him, doesn't register as a bad thing for him. Those are instances of what Aristotle calls the non-voluntary. So you don't have regret over what happens, like the way you might regret accidentally slipping and falling into somebody or giving a drug addict $10. But you don't care. And that's the case of the non-voluntary. All right. Now we've gotten a sense, therefore, of what the voluntary and the involuntary are. Let me hone in on the voluntary and say a specific aspect of it, which is what Aristotle calls the chosen. The chosen just means behavior that is pursuant to a choice. That is something that we have chosen to do and opted for. Now, the first thing to say about this is that Aristotle is very clear that this subset, the chosen, which is a subset of the voluntary, is a sort of behavior done only by mature human beings. Um, excuse me. It's the sort of behavior that follows from deliberation. So deliberation is really what we need to talk about. Now, we need to say a little bit about what does it mean to deliberate. Well, I think the first thing we should say is that when we deliberate, we are aware of various options that we could choose. We are aware of various things, and we are aware of them as options that we could choose to do in pursuit of a certain goal. So, in a situation with deliberation, there's always some sort of goal that we're pursuing. Now, the very first week, I used an example which I think is relevant again. And that's the example of being healthy. So let's just say that's somebody's goal. And that will be the end of the process, right? That they will do all sorts of things in a certain process that lead them toward being healthy. Now, if I have this goal, this is what I'm pursuing, then there are various means I can try to follow in order to achieve this goal. I could go on a very serious diet. I could start meditating. I could start exercising. I can do a combination of these things. Now, as I'm beginning this process of trying to be healthy, let's say that I realize that those are options I can choose as means to the end of being healthy. Those are all possibilities for me. It's not really possible for me to be healthy just by willing myself to be healthy. I can't just sit here and say, I'm going to be healthy, I'm going to be healthy. Um, Writing a novel about health or writing an essay about health is not really a possible means to being healthy. Talking about being healthy is not really a possible means to being healthy. Posting on Facebook about my desire to be healthy will not actually be a possible means to being healthy. It's a means to having people like my posts. It's a means to having people respond and maybe respect me for having this desire or encourage me. But in and of itself, it's not really a possible means. It doesn't do anything for my health. It doesn't have any effect on that whatsoever. So there's a limited range, almost necessarily a limited range of things that we can deliberate about and opt for as means to helping us achieve our goals. In this case, there's a limited range of things that I can deliberate about and opt for as proper means to help me achieve the goal of being healthy. Now, I think I just want to pause for a second and say a tad bit more about that. There's a phenomenon that uh, basically boils down to this like choice paralysis we have in today's culture. What does that mean? It means that there are almost too many options that sometimes we have presented before us, or we think we have presented before us. Um, for example, you can get satellite TV, and they give you the quote unquote set of options of having 250 channels. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that that's almost too many to deliberate about. How do you weigh and consider 250 channels while you're simultaneously surfing through those channels? How do you compare one to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other, and see which is the best or most fitting for you right now. How do you see that this is what you really want to watch when you consider that there's 15 other options that may be as good? And so we end up trying to debate so many things in our mind. Like, if I choose to watch this show, it means I can't watch that show, but maybe I wanted to watch that show more, so I don't know which one to do. Or this is a movie I haven't seen in a while. I didn't really like it, but I do like parts of it, so maybe I should do that. But there's this other movie on that I really like the ending to, and it's got some great music and some very good acting, so maybe I should watch that. And it's just so many different deliberations that we're going through that we can't really make up our minds. So it's a paralysis, and that can be very debilitating in a sense. We don't have the ability to really think about and weigh and consider 250 different options, or all the different options in a grocery store aisle. As human beings, we're much actually better suited to dealing with a set, finite, and appropriate number of options that we can consider, reflect on, weigh, deliberate about, and ultimately opt for. Yeah. And let me go to the example I talked about to really bring this point home. I talked about the example of various means that I could opt for, various things I could opt for that are means to the goal of being healthy. Diet, exercise, well, and then let's say diet pills. We'll use as a third option. Three different means. They're not mutually exclusive. I can choose some or all of these, or I can choose just one, but it's limited, it's finite. I can get a fairly decent sense of this. I can have decent awareness of what these options are and how relevant or appropriate or apt they are for my life right now. Now, let's say it turns out that I'm living with other people. We have communal meals together. Uh, food is just not something that I have total control over. And insofar as I continue to live in this place, I kind of have to eat along with the rest of the people there. I can make choices about how much I eat, but I can't go on a strict Atkins diet or South Beach diet or 30-day crash diet or something like that. I can't do that because I don't have the ability to get my own food at this point. And that's just the way my life is. So I understand that. The second thing is I realize that I don't have health insurance, and the ability to buy a diet pill or get prescribed diet pills is not a financially sound option for me. I could do it, but it may be really monetarily difficult for me to do it. So it seems like the diet and the exercise and the diet and diet pills options, though in themselves fine, are not really fit for where I'm at in life now, which would mean that exercise is likely the best choice right now. And that can change, that the other things perhaps become more available. Maybe I move out. Maybe the situation where I'm living changes and I get more control over the food that's bought, what's eaten, when it's eaten, etc. Right here, right now, insofar as I want to opt for something definitive that will be a means toward the goal of being healthy, it looks like my best option is to opt for an exercise routine, regimen. So what we see here is that I'm opting for something that's a possible means to the goal of being healthy. And it's something that's opted for in comparison, contrast with other possible means. I choose one, and in a sense, by choosing one, I'm not choosing the others, and I'm kind of brushing them aside and bracketing them off for, at least for right now. It's inevitable choice. Choice for A means not B. It's not a bad thing. It's just, again, the limited, finite human condition that we have to wrestle with and respond to and do as we can with. Now, that being the case, I've opted for exercise. But that itself then opens up a further set of deliberations. What do I mean by that? Well, now I have to deliberate about the particular type of exercise I want to practice insofar as I'm exercising as a means to the goal of being healthy. So again, we see another process of deliberation occurring here. Now, what can I deliberate about in this instance? Well, I can deliberate about, do I want to go running? Do I want to use an exercise bike at the local gym? Do I want to use the rowing machine at the local gym? Do I want to do speed walking? Do I want to go swimming? Do I want to do some combination of these? And again, it's a limited, finite set number of options. And I weigh and consider these. Turns out that the swimming is not available often. The gym membership is prohibitively expensive. So that rules out perhaps the exercise bike and the rowing machine. And the speed walking I feel weird about and I'm not very good at. So running turns out to be my best option. So we've done two processes of deliberation. One was choosing exercise, and then once that was chosen, it was what form of exercise. And then there's even, I'd say, further processes of deliberation I can engage in. For example, I can deliberate about where I want to run, when I want to run, how often I want to run, etc. And you get the point. So in deliberation, we're basically looking around at our options that can be possible means to our goals, and we're opting for one. We're deciding on one. We're trying to stick with that. It may be the case that we bring in the other options later, but right now we've realized that this is the best we can do. We go with that, and we see how far we can take it. Now, how much freedom do we have in this process? Let's try to get more down to brass tacks. According to Aristotle and Aquinas, what can happen is the following. If we have formed ourselves in certain ways by our habits, and this is something we've talked about for a number of weeks here, so this is a continuation of that theme. If we formed ourselves in a certain way according to the way we habitually act, according to the kind of habits we've made in our lives, then that will play a decisive and very significant role in what kind of deliberation we do, what we see as options for our lives, what kind of goals we pursue. So this whole process of deliberation, in which there's a goal that we want to pursue, and we see certain options as means to that goal, and we opt for one of them, that whole process is influenced by the kind of persons we have formed ourselves to be. Our habits play a huge role in this. So let me get down to more clarity about this situation. Now, suppose that I have over time formed myself into a rather cowardly person. I have done actions that are cowardly, and eventually I have a habit of being cowardly. It's just kind of become more deeply ingrained. It's kind of become part of who I am. I'm sort of my second nature. I fall back on cowardly behavior a lot, and that's just a deep part of me now. Now, same situation. Person, I recognize that, hey, I need to lose weight. I want to be healthy. That's a real recognition. I have it. And now I begin to think about what sort of options I have for realizing this goal. So I had the same goal, but now I have a cowardly disposition or habit. And what will that do for me as I'm trying to deliberate about the best possible means to achieving this goal of being healthy? Well, if I'm cowardly, I might be afraid that I won't follow through with this. I won't have the guts to keep exercising. I just won't have the stick to itness to follow through and to have the mental fortitude to keep going even when I don't want to. So exercise doesn't really appear as much of an option for me. I'm just like, no, I don't have it. I'm not strong enough to do that. I don't have what it takes. So I don't even really consider that as an option. Now, again, we saw earlier that there are basically three options. There's diet pills, and exercise. Um, so immediately for the cowardly person, one of those options is off the table, gone, right? So he's gonna like, well, then he thinks about diet. He's like, well, that would take a lot of mental fortitude, a lot of toughness. I don't have that. I'm kind of a weak person. So I'm just gonna go with the diet pill, and that's it. And that's what he goes with. So in that case, that person had the same kind of goal, but he didn't even really think about or be aware of the greater range of possible choices or possible options that he could deliberate about. They weren't even on his radar. The only thing that began to make any sense for him was just to go on a diet pill because he was too afraid that he wouldn't have what it takes to even begin the following through with the other options, the exercise and or the diet. So because of the way the person has formed himself to be, it limits and influences what kind of options he sees for himself in terms of what means he has for achieving his goal. He has a much narrower scope of vision. So let's go with this a little bit more. Instead of saying that there's somebody who's cowardly, now let's talk about somebody perhaps who has really become intemperate, self-indulgent. This is somebody who has not really controlled what he eats or how he eats it, or what he drinks or how he drinks it. Um, it's gotten out of hand, and it's gotten out of hand for a long time. And he's just sort of become the sort of person, the kind of person who does this. He's identified with it. It's become part of who he is, part of his being. It's a second nature for him. He does it automatically, he does it reflexively. There's no real deliberation about it. It's the default mode. It's what he expects of himself. And let's say this person is starting to gain a lot of weight. And on one level, he's dissatisfied with that. He's not totally comfortable with that. But does he even really want to be healthy? Does he have the wish for that? That's something Aristotle talks about. You have to you wish for certain ends and certain good things. But maybe if your life has become really corrupted or really problematic in this way, you might not even have a basic wish for being healthy. You might not even see that as a goal worth pursuing and really desire it on a deep level. You might have some sense that something's wrong and maybe half-heartedly kind of think about that, but it's not a real full, deep, heartfelt wish to be healthy or desire for that or positing that as a really significant goal for yourself. Other people may talk to you about it, but eventually you just, if you formed yourself into that person, you might think that's not really, I don't care, right? I don't really care about that anymore. That's really sad. I think that can happen to all of us in certain respects. I mean, I'm picking on this person just as one example. I mean, but there's lots of areas I think in all of our lives where we've formed ourselves in certain ways such that we don't even wish for, strongly desire, or want to pursue certain goals that could be quite good for us. So it's not even that we have a limited scope about the possible options to the goal. It's that we don't even really recognize that that's a very valuable and significant goal that we ought to pursue. So that's we the cowardly person at least recognized health as a good goal, even if he had a very limited sense of how he could pursue it. But with this person we're talking about, and I think that often in our own lives in general, we are so limited in our scope and our understanding and our vision of things, our radars, if you will, and we're so limited based on the way we've lived for a long time and what we've habitually become, that we don't even recognize that there's certain good goals we can pursue and ought to pursue. Now, that is a pretty depressing thought, and I don't quite want to end on that, because what we've also been talking about is that this human capacity for knowledge and deliberation and being an agent can never fully be taken away from us. It's always within us to some extent. And there's always a possibility of it being reactivated, reawakened, at least in small ways. So I think that would mean for somebody, for example, in the case of the person you're talking about, this intemperate person, this self-indulgent person, it may be the case that enough positive influence from other people, enough good discussions with other people, enough people taking some actual interest in him can awaken in him some internal motivation to pursue what they're all talking about, i.e., being a little bit healthier. It's always quite limited. It's narrow. It's not going to be a fully articulated goal for him. It's not going to be something that he really has a good sense about, perhaps. But it's never the case that our freedom and our voluntariness and our ability to deliberate is eradicated. It's always there in us. And that's something that we have to kind of trust, I think, and realize that no matter the circumstances, we are not, again, like the ball being moved around. There's something in us, some spark of freedom, some spark of being able to deliberate and choose that can have perhaps be ignited or reignited and light our path and provide us with a better vision, a better seeing of the world around us and what sort of goals we can pursue and what options we can choose. And again, as I said, it's always done according to the fact that we are finite human beings. We can only respond to finite situations and finite contexts and finite number of options and finite goals. It's always very limited, but it's real and it's genuine and it's quite significant. And I'd actually go with this far. It has life or death significance because the way we exercise this ability for voluntary behavior, for chosen behavior, for deliberation will determine how well our lives are lived and how well we ultimately face our death. So on that note, I will end the first lecture for this series in week number